Good morning, everyone. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., which is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit research center focused on economic, political, and social life in the Arab world and U.S. policies in the region. We're here today to basically announce the results of our most recent public opinion survey conducted in affiliation with our partners at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha regarding U.S. presidential elections 2016 and how the Arab street or average Arab citizens look at these elections and what do they anticipate. By way of introduction, let me say that presidential elections 2016 are not your conventional or typical elections by any standard, domestic or foreign. The identity of the candidates vying for the highest position in the land, their positions on various domestic and international issues, and the highly confrontational and intense nature of the campaign attracted widespread attention at home and abroad. The Arab world is no exception to that. It's particularly focused on U.S. election, considering the candidates' desperate and controversial positions vis-à-vis the region and their politically motivated attempts throughout the campaign to drag Arab governments and people as potential props amid their heated race. Many questions have been raised over the past year and a half about the impact of the U.S. campaign on relations with the Arab world. How do average Arab citizens perceive the electoral process in the United States? Do U.S. elections matter to them? Do Arabs think that the outcome of presidential elections in the U.S. impacts their lives in their respective countries or in the Arab region at large? Do Arabs favor one candidate over the other? What worries Arab people about U.S. foreign policy, and what are their expectations after November 8th? These and other legitimate questions prompted the Arab Center Washington, D.C., ACW, to conduct a public opinion survey in the Arab world in cooperation, as I said, with our colleagues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, Qatar. And the polling was actually carried out by a group called 1-to-1, a British-registered public survey company that's based in Tunisia. The survey was conducted on October 21st through the 31st. We literally just finished gathering all the numbers last night, and focused on a randomly selected sample of 3,600 respondents covering 9 Arab countries, namely Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Palestine, both West Bank and Gaza, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia. The respondents, 400 from each country listed above, were selected at random using cluster sampling techniques by geography and probability proportional to size method, PPS, to ensure a sample representative of different segments of Arab society, such as age, gender, educational level, and geographic locale. The sample has a margin of error of plus or minus 5% due to the limited size of each sample in each country. Let me say that we got delayed a bit in terms of logistics. Jordan's result did not arrive till this morning, so they will not be included in the survey this morning. However, they will be added to the updated version of the results, the report that you have in your folder, and will be posted on our website maybe later this afternoon with the added information regarding Jordan. What I would like to do is present you the results, the main results of the survey after grouping them into, let's say, 5 different clusters. The first one deals with Arab attitudes toward the United States in general. Can we have the first slide, please? Okay. The first question was, generally speaking, how would you evaluate U.S. foreign policy toward the Arab world? And also several questions about your own personal attitude toward the United States and toward the American people. When asked about their general views of the United States, almost one-half of the Arab public expressed positive views. However, consistent with similar public opinion polls, there is a strong Arab distrust of U.S. foreign policy that has been evidenced almost in every public opinion survey taken in the region. The survey shows that anti-American sentiment in the Arab world focuses or targets U.S. foreign policies in the region and not the U.S. as a country or its population. The discrepancy between sentiment toward the U.S., sentiment toward the American people, and sentiment toward U.S. policy is huge and significant discrepancy. Overall, 67% of Arabs have a negative or somewhat negative attitude toward U.S. policy in the Arab world. In contrast, as you see in this particular slide, you see the numbers go up over 70% who expressed positive overall views of the American people and the United States as a country. So this is the first significant, I think, finding in our survey. But again, it's not new. It's not news to some of you who have been doing public opinion surveys or aware of public opinion surveys in the region. In terms of individual countries, it's also very interesting to notice that probably Egypt and Palestine tend to be the most critical populations in the Arab world with regards to both U.S. policy and lower, if you will, sympathy or support for the United States in these two countries. The two countries where the numbers were extremely high in terms of basically sympathy for the United States and the American people, it was interesting that there was a huge discrepancy also or difference between the numbers we obtained in, let's say, Tunisia and Morocco. Followed by Kuwait, and being the kind of most positive with regards to the United States. In terms of Arab countries surveyed, respondents in Iraq, Morocco, and Tunisia, almost by similar numbers with lower 30s, 33% in Iraq, 33% in Morocco, 31% in Tunisia, expressed the most overall positive views of foreign policy. Okay, this is much lower than their support for the United States or their positive response to the United States in general, but these were the highest numbers with regards to the policy itself. Meanwhile, respondents in Algeria, 78%, and Palestine, equal number, 78%, expressed the most negative views of U.S. foreign policy in the regions for clear reasons, particularly in Palestine, and definitely the attitude of the Algerian people on Palestine tend to be stronger, as a matter of fact, at this time than any other Arab country. So regarding attitudes toward the American people, Kuwaitis hold the most positive views at 82%, while Algerians express the most negative views of the American people at 26%, which was, I think, the lowest number found. The second cluster of questions dealt with U.S. presidential candidates, which is the topic, the title of the survey. A significant proportion of Arabs do follow news of the elections. As a matter of fact, in some parts of the Arab world, I have a feeling that a higher percentage of Arabs follow news substantively than Americans follow their news, and they don't seem to kind of give up. About 60% of Arabs follow the U.S. presidential race on a regular or occasional basis, I think that's very significant for the Middle East. The majority of whom keep up with developments using satellite or cable television, and the percentage there is 59%. And that reflects basically the change in the media in the region and the significance of satellite networks in the region these days. And the internet at 30%. So between, and because it's, frankly, logistically or technically these days, it's very difficult to distinguish between some of the satellite stations that you can only view on the internet anyway in some countries because they're not allowed to function in some countries. So we're talking about 60 plus 30. That's 90% of Arabs get their news about American elections through modern media. And that is, I think, very significant. Regarding the candidates themselves, 56% to 60% hold positive views of Hillary Clinton overall, with the most positive attitudes among Tunisians at 65%, and the most negative views of Clinton held by Palestinians at 54%. And that's not surprising considering her positions, if you will, and her history on this particular issue. Donald Trump, on the other hand, garners 60% negative views, almost the same positive views on the other side, on the Democratic side, 60% negative views among the Arab public, with Kuwaitis expressing the most negative view at 69% negative about Kuwait, about Trump in Kuwait, and Iraqis holding the most positive views of Donald Trump at 34%. I have a feeling that this has to do with, of course, the events in Iraq at this time, and definitely the sentiment in the Gulf, particularly in Kuwait and other Gulf countries, tends to reflect Trump's statements during the campaign about Islam and preventing Muslims from entering the country and so on. Overall, the Arab public clearly prefers Clinton to become the next president. The numbers stand at about 66%. It's ironic. I don't know whether that would help her campaign or not at this late stage, considering the racist sentiment in this regard. But 11% in the Arab world prefer Trump over Clinton, and about 11% additional show no preference at all, and about an additional 11% answered they do not know. So the numbers are quite significant in terms of the difference between 66% preferring Clinton to win on November 8th versus 11% preferring Trump. Respondents in countries like in North Africa, let's say Morocco, for example, 78%, and Tunisia, 76%, strongly preferred Clinton. So these are her highest numbers in the region, in comparison with 56% of Egyptians and 59% of Iraqis and Palestinians. The third cluster of questions focused on perceived impact of elections on US foreign policy. In other words, do you, as an Arab, believe that the elections will have an impact on US foreign policy in the region, which is, like I said early, is viewed as the most negative part or aspect of the United States, its foreign policy in the region. So when asked about whether they believe the US presidential election will impact US foreign policy, 26% of Arabs do not expect US elections to change US policy globally throughout the world. When asked about the impact of the elections on US policy specifically toward the Arab world, the number increases slightly to about 30%. Not very significant rise, but nonetheless, few points higher, 4 points higher. Overall, the Arab public is split between believing there will be no change and believing there will be some change to US foreign policy globally. At equally 35% between the two. and about US foreign policy in the Arab world at about 33%. Palestinians and Algerians, again, have the least faith in the influence of the presidential elections on US policy, with 39% of Palestinians and 32% of Algerians believing there will be no change to US policy globally. Similarly, 38% of both Palestinians and Algerians surveyed believe the elections have no impact on US foreign policy toward the Arab world in particular, or specifically toward the Arab world. On the other hand, respondents in Iraq, again, if you consider what's happening in Iraq today, believe that the presidential elections will lead to a significant change to US foreign policy globally at about 26%, and to US foreign policy in the Arab world, similar number, slightly higher at about 28%. In comparing Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, 70% of Arabs believe that Clinton will have the most positive impact on US foreign policy globally, compared to 13% only who believe Trump will have the most positive impact on US foreign policy in general. Regarding US policy vis-à-vis the Arab world, or toward the Arab world, although Clinton is still believed to have the most positive impact, her numbers do drop from the 70% globally to 55% when respondents are asked about the candidates with regards to US foreign policy vis-à-vis the Arab world. In comparison, a mere 14% believe that Trump will have the most positive impact on US policy throughout the region. When asked about the candidate that will have the most positive influence on US policy specifically toward your country, toward their own countries, Tunisians expressed the most faith in Hillary Clinton, which was the highest throughout the survey at 72%, while Palestinians expressed the least faith in Clinton with 47%, believing a Clinton presidency will have a positive impact on US policy toward Palestine. In addition, 34% of Palestinians believe that neither Trump nor Hillary will have a positive impact on US policy toward their country. In contrast, again, Iraqi respondents expressed the most faith in Donald Trump, with 19% believing a Trump presidency will have a positive impact on US policy toward Iraq, and it has something to do with policy toward Iran, with policy toward what to do in Iraq next, and so on. The fourth cluster of questions deal with expectations after the elections. What do you expect from these elections? Following a Clinton presidency or a Trump victory, respondents were asked about their expectations from the next president regarding support for democratic transition in the Arab countries. Who do you think will be better in the transition toward democracy in the region? They were also asked to express their perspectives on anti-American sentiment in the region. Who will generate more anti-American sentiment, Clinton or Trump? And in terms of security and stability in the region, who will effect more stability and security in the region? Almost half of the Arab public, 43%, believes that a Clinton victory would increase American support for democratic transition in the Arab countries, while 26% believe it would not at all. On the other hand, 47% of Arabs believe a Trump presidency would not at all contribute to democratic transition, while a large proportion of respondents believe that a Trump victory would greatly contribute to increased anti-American sentiment, 34%, and to increase anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia globally at about 39%. A small proportion of Arabs believe that Clinton would contribute greatly, 15%, or somewhat, 36%, to increased stability and security in the region, whereas 47% believe that a Trump presidency would not at all contribute to stability and security in the Arab world. Iraqi respondents hold the highest positive expectations from a Clinton victory overall and the least negative expectation from a Trump presidency. The fifth and last cluster of questions dealt with Arab perspectives on U.S. Middle East policy itself. Regarding the top issues that the next U.S. president should focus on, the largest proportion, 26% of the respondents, believe that the U.S., and this is, I think, very significant and reflective of the general sentiment in the Arab world, believe that the U.S. should not intervene in the affairs of Arab countries. Leave us alone was the message of this particular cluster of questions. While a similar number, only 1 point lower, 25%, indicated fighting ISIS or ISIL is or should be the top priority for the next U.S. president. Iraqis, for clear reasons, at 45%, and Tunisians at 38%, expressed combating ISIS or ISIL as their top priority for the next administration, while respondents in Palestine, 46%, and Algeria, at 23%, believe the Palestinian cause should be the top priority for the next U.S. president. So when asked about their opinion regarding the entities, the final question, the entities in the U.S., the institutions or entities that are most influential within the American political system in formulating U.S. foreign policy, Arab respondents picked basically the U.S. Congress as being, which is the exact opposite probably from what the American public picks, where the U.S. Congress enjoys a whopping like 9% popularity at this time. There seems to be more support or more, the perception in the Arab world is that Congress is the most influential, followed by the U.S. president, and after that, the pro-Israel lobby in third place. So with that, I will basically end my summary and would ask my colleague, Dr. Imad Harb, to comment for about 10, 12 minutes about what he perceived as substantial or important in these results, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after that. Amen.
Good morning. Glad to be here. Thanks for coming. This little cold day. It's not quite cold, but anyway, it's one of those surveys that is trying to gauge Arab public opinion at a very, very crucial time in the Arab world and in U.S. history as well. This is a very pivotal campaign, presidential campaign. A lot of people are wondering how much of an influence will it have on the future of U.S. policy in the Middle East or anywhere else. There are a lot of things that are going on that require American, basically, firmness, intervention, and decisiveness, so to speak, in world affairs and specifically in the Middle East. I don't think this thing is on, is it? It is? There were quite a few points to make about the survey, and it's rather comprehensive. The countries that it tries to gauge the opinions of are in a way representative, basically, of Arab public opinion. Unfortunately, there are limitations as to how you conduct these surveys. And there are certain people who whose opinions may not appear in these surveys, but yet at the same time, the sampling, I understand it was like 400 in each country. The sampling is rather good. Some things that appear in the survey, basically it tells you that, like they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The United States and the Middle East in general, whether it is in a presidential election year or any other regular year, the United States holds a lot of basically gets a lot of attention in the Middle East, obviously, in the Arab world. And the presidential year, it really is going definitely to hold much more attention. U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has never really been something that, Arabs have really cared for or approved very much. And this survey shows that basically it's where it is, with a little bit of changes that have been actually the result of things that have happened over probably about since 2000. The terrorist attacks of 2001 have definitely changed American foreign policy in fundamental ways, and thus the responses to that, to the understanding of those changes has actually affected how the Arab world sees the United States. One thing is the issue of the sectarian divide in the Arab world has, I saw in the survey that it has shown just a little bit of, it had reared its head, so to speak, in the surveys. For instance, when we look at the numbers for Iraq, for instance, there are certain things that have happened in among the before 2003 and after 2003, changes of opinions, so to speak, towards the United States that were influenced by the actual event of 2003, and who came to power after 2003 affected the points of view of the respondents in the survey. The majority before 2003 expressed different opinions about what the United States is like or was able to do after 2003, and yet today's majority in Iraq is speaking of a way that is reflective of where their political allegiances actually lie. They are Iraqis, but yet at the same time, they are opposed to certain ways that the American foreign policy has showed itself in the Middle East before and after 2003. Another important thing that I noticed here is the issue of, there are certain things that are going on. The United States foreign policy in Syria is not something that Arabs are really very happy about. Although there are differences between how the Moroccans and the Tunisians and the Algerians answered and how the Levantines answered the same question. So, for instance, in Tunisia, they were really quite happy with U.S. foreign policy as it's going on now. I don't think that the same answers would have been gotten had the survey been conducted before 2011. So after 2011 and the democratic transition in Tunisia, obviously the United States and specifically Secretary Clinton is looked at as someone who has really effected some really positive democratic change in Tunis, and that showed itself in the surveys, in the survey of Tunisian public opinion. The old thing about the Palestinians, how the Palestinians responded to certain questions, obviously showed whether it is U.S. foreign policy, whether it is the American people, whether it is U.S. foreign policy towards their own country, whether it is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, showed how the Palestinians feel about how the United States looks at their issue. They're obviously concerned that the United States has not, and they wonder if the United States will actually change its policy towards them regarding what's going on in their lives. There is something that I noticed in the Egyptian case. It was really strange that I think the number was like 11% who would appreciate a Donald Trump presidency or something. And in a way, this it demonstrates a little bit of a split of opinion here between the people who were surveyed and the actual people in power. I don't think that the people in power really will be very, very happy with Hillary Clinton coming to the White House, although, I mean, they're obviously not going to declare any public opinions on that, but I think the Egyptian regime would probably prefer that Hillary Clinton doesn't get to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And obviously the public opinion survey showed differently what the opinion is differently from the people in power. There was something else about the issue of how do they get their news? You know, the issue of, this is what Khalil mentioned, the idea of them going to the television stations, and yes, they do watch television for their news. Not much, you know, it's negligible in the newspapers, and that reflects a general decline of newspaper readership anywhere in the world. But specifically in these surveys, I think the numbers were like 2% and 3% and things like that. Rather, it's almost negligible. And yet at the same time, there's almost from anywhere between 20 and 30% or 35% actually who get their news from the internet, which shows two things. Number one, what Khalil mentioned is that television stations are talking about issues, and you get your information from television station, but yet at the same time, there is an underlying trend of going technological by looking at the internet, which shows that the educated public is either on television or doing the internet thing. And this also tells me that maybe there is an element, I don't know what the sampling exactly is broken down into, youth age groups or something like that, but I would imagine that a lot of the people who answered about the internet usage are probably among the youth, which is a good development anyway. Something else about the issue of whether the United States foreign policy will change or not change. It has a lot to do with how the Arab world has and continues to have opinions on the formulation of United States foreign policy. In other words, the Arab world has traditionally looked at the formulation of U.S. foreign policy as something that is done for the purpose of protecting and advancing U.S. economic interests, and might I add imperialist interests. So the issue of change and not change, it's not quite there yet, because people are trying to see if there is any change actually in formulation of American policy, whether it is only going to be reflecting American economic interest as a great power, or is it going to reflect a change in American foreign policy towards understanding other people, towards understanding other nations. So this is something that's probably still in the works. It's not quite there yet. On the issue of Clinton in Tunisia, they definitely would like Clinton. They love her because she was instrumental when the regime was changed in 2011, the democratic transition. For the Palestinians, obviously, Clinton has had questionable positions on what amounts for the Palestinians of really sincere adherence to what their rights are. So that's actually something that is to be looked at. Maybe a Clinton administration would want to try to change that. I noticed something on the issue of the Arab public. This is an Arab public that lives, what's the distance, 10,000 kilometers away. They're actually quite, from the results of the survey, it shows that there is an educated and sophisticated public. A foreign public that would look at the United States and say that, about 40% that produces 40% of people thinking that actually Congress is the one that really influences foreign policy, although foreign policy is the purview of the executive branch. Congress is only the purse holder. For them to think that the Congress is really a very instrumental institution in U.S. Foreign policy is really quite interesting. Also, obviously, the White House, they do think that the executive leadership, I think the average is probably about 30%. But yet again, they also pointed out to the Zionist lobby in the United States. And this is something that reflects old traditions, old understandings of U.S. foreign policy as being very heavy on Israel friendliness, so to speak. So in a way, they blame that basically on the influence of the American Jewish lobby, obviously. The Iraqis and Tunisians are really quite concerned about ISIS, and that reflects because, if you probably did the survey in Syria, they probably would say ISIS as well, because it is a concern. So ISIS in Northern Africa is becoming a very big threat to Tunisian democracy and stability, and it is a threat to Iraqi stability as well. I think I'll stop it here, and maybe we'll discuss it a little more in the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imad. Now the floor is open for Qs and As, and let's start with Jafar. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and direct or ask your question. Thank you.
Jafar Jafari with Al Mayadeen TV. I'd like to focus on the U.S. foreign policy in terms of change that the survey has indicated. And if I read it correctly, it says almost no change, around 30% of the Arab population. Now, if we take it a little further, the U.S. foreign policy in the United States itself is almost synonymous with regime change, whether it's democratic methods or violent methods through military intervention. Now, this did not reflect in this, or this sentiment was not reflected in this survey. And I wonder what criteria was used to assess the U.S. foreign policy after 6 years or so of direct military intervention in Libya, in Iraq, and in other places. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, this is essentially a survey. A survey doesn't debate issues or content of whether it is the subject matter of the question with the respondents. That would probably come up if we were conducting a survey on U.S. foreign policy toward the region, where you would have maybe 10, 20, 30 different questions dealing with that. This was a survey about elections. So in general, we left it up to the sample, the respondents, based on their own. If you notice, all these questions were prefaced with the remark that how do you feel? So the definition was left. We did not want to basically put words in an objective survey in the mouth of the respondents. We left it up to them to define. Is there value in pursuing a survey on U.S. foreign policy in detail as to how they view it compared to U.S. citizens and how they view it from their own experience, let's say on the shorter end of the stick, if you will, of U.S. foreign policy in the region? I think it's worth it, and we will pursue that in future surveys. But this one does not, you're right, does not reflect detail of that, particularly in terms of trying to compare how the typical, let's say, American citizen versus the typical Arab citizen define or view U.S. foreign policy. It's a good suggestion. We'll take it into consideration. By the way, we are planning a post-election survey. So in 3 weeks, we will begin a totally different survey saying so-and-so won. Now, we can get into a little bit more detail in terms of the specific programs that were advertised by these candidates, should they pursue those, which many of them, of course, will be simply campaign rhetoric that will not see the day of light in terms of the next administration, but some of them would. So there will be a more detailed survey with regards to the policy of the winning candidate in the next few weeks. Sure. Advance results, okay. All right, next. Right here, please.
Yeah, how comprehensive was the pool of telephone numbers from which the respondents were selected? Did it include landlines and cell phones? And how widespread is the penetration of telephones in these various countries?
It was a multi-tier effort. Basically, the pool that you refer to is the result of actually face-to-face interviews and where a number was requested so that you can call that number and get a response. Some gave their landlines, some gave their cell phones. Most people in the Middle East, my guess, I mean, this is not a scientific thing, my guess is about, just like here now, probably 80%, if not 90%, of people in the Middle East no longer use landline for these types of conversations. They use their cell phones. Cell phones are becoming actually more predominant in the region, and you can hardly get anybody on their landline. So the pool itself is a sizable pool. We've used it in previous surveys. It's about 24,000 people. And, but this time, again, as I said, scientifically, randomly, chose smaller population to do this particular survey in these specific 9 countries based on a sample of 400 people each, which is usually lower than what we do. But again, the speed and the pressure of the elections here, trying to finish the survey before the elections was a factor. But it is, somebody asked earlier or referred to the issue of the factors taking into consideration in picking. We have taken all that stuff into consideration, definitely. As I said in my introductory remarks, age, geography, gender, all that stuff has been taken into consideration. The countries involved, if you notice, on purpose, were selected to make sure that the majority of the population in the Arab world, in other words, the so-called quote-unquote big countries in the Arab world are included. So that's the bulk of the Arab population when you consider Egypt and Iraq and Algeria and so on. But at the same time, we took special care scientifically to weigh the results to make sure that the vote of, or the response of an Egyptian is not worth more than that of a citizen of a smaller country. So all these factors were factored in. Some people think it's controversial, but basically we view that the majority of people in the Arab world, and that has been reflected in our surveys, tend to be under the age of 25. So you're talking about in some countries more than 65%. So yes, youth is definitely very well represented and is reflected in those exact numbers. The same thing with the gender issues. We feel that most surveys done in the Middle East, again, in the name of objectivity, they tend to count or underrepresent females. we feel that any serious analysis of Arab society needs to give women half the population. Some people say, well, it's 48. Some people say, well, in some other countries it's 56. So it balances out. We treat basically our surveys as 50-50 in terms of gender.
My name is Amal David from Arab America, digital media. After San Bernardino, Donald Trump asked one question, why these people hate us. So I am thinking more and more, I like this to be done scientifically, why the people in the Arab world hate us in America.
I think it's worthwhile as a full survey at one point. First of all, I don't accept the premise. Clearly, the first three charts and the first three questions do not represent hatred, blind hatred, the way Trump is talking about, to Americans or to the United States. The results were very clear that in some countries, an overwhelming majority view the US positively, view the American people positively. So the answer to your question and to Mr. Trump, it's the policy stupid. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, it's fine.
How did you decide to survey these 8 countries, and what percentage of the total Arab population do they represent? And I had a question for Dr. Herb. If you could expand on your point about changing Iraqi attitudes. I didn't quite understand what the point you're trying to make. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there is no political significance to the countries. Every time we try to do a survey, first of all, we want to ensure that a majority of the population of the Arab world are included in the survey. So when you add up the population of these countries, that speaks for itself. So it's a logistical decision more than anything else. The second one is you might be ready to do a survey in the Arab world, but the Arab world might not be ready for you to do a survey in the Arab world. So that's also a decision that you have to take into consideration as to which 8 or 9 countries. My preference is to do 22. But logistically, it's a nightmare. Some countries require very strict permission for you to function, to bring in people from the outside, to do the training. It's a logistical nightmare doing surveys in a scientific and objective way. So it doesn't work all the time for the same 8 or 9 countries or 10 countries. We have averaged, the survey we've done before, a year and a half ago, dealt with the Arab attitudes toward Daesh, which produced very significant results in terms of the animosity of most Arabs, very high percentages, in some countries reaching 90+%. Although some people in this country chose to look at when you say 95% of Lebanese are against Daesh, somebody wrote an article in this great town saying, what worries me is the other 5%. I mean, it's mind-boggling sometimes. But the choices basically are dictated in a way by who's available, what country can you move quickly. We have these teams. These teams are natives and in their respective countries. And they get trained regularly, and they get trained prior to each survey to be aware of the questions and so on. And of course, they rotate. They are not the same people, so you have to keep training. And so that we leave up to the pollster. That's a professional decision on their part to do. We simply propose the survey, we propose the countries, and then they proceed of saying, which countries are they ready and willing to proceed with. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, but we try as much as possible to make sure that there is enough weighing of large versus small, and enough to ensure that there is a majority of the Arab population included in the chosen 9 or 10 countries. Would you like to respond to your?
Can I speak from here?
You can,
okay.
yes.
Yeah, what I meant is, the survey results showed not absolutely clearly, and not in any, just too much on this side or too much on that side, but it was obvious that some of the responses, actually a lot of the responses, had translated into historical periods of Iraq. In other words, in reference to 2003, the majority Shia population that was repressed up to 2003 showed a little bit of a different opinion of the United States in this survey in 2016 than it would have shown had it been 2002. That's my point. My point is that the change in leadership in Iraq had an influence, and that was brought by the United States, had an influence on how people perceive the United States, obviously. So the majority, when you look at 400 people being surveyed, you would imagine that, I don't think that anybody really tried to do, okay, we're going to do 135 Sunnis and 200 Shia and so, but the idea is that you would think that the sampling would reflect political realities of the society. And the political reality is that after 2003, there was a fundamental change in politics in Iraq. Thus, the people who responded to certain questions about American foreign policy responded according to those political realities. So the majority before 2003 did not have an opinion. After 2003, it did have an opinion. The minority before 2003 had the opinion. Now they don't have as much opinion. So that's exactly specifically what I meant by that.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Munji Dawari from the Center of the Study of Islam and Democracy. Quick questions. The number one is that to answer these questions, people have to be informed about the topics you ask them about, or at least perceive themselves to be informed. So is there a difference that you see between countries where we know that the media is very, not all controlled, but the narrative is controlled by the government or the regime, and other countries where, relatively speaking, there's free media? Also, what struck me in looking at most of this is that the Palestinians seem to be the least ones to say, I don't know, in most of the questions. So they seem to be maybe know more or perceive themselves to know more. And this question is maybe for Dr. Ahmed. What would be the takeaway if you're President of the United States on November 9th? What would be the takeaway from this?
I'll never be allowed. I wasn't born here. I was born in Kenya.
All right. The first question in terms of the information available to citizens in different countries. Of course, that varies from country to country. Some countries are more open than others still in the Middle East. But I would say, I'm just guessing because frankly, we did not test that in this survey. But I'm just putting my cumulative experience from looking at a variety of surveys conducted by the Arab Center, which, by the way, the Arab Center in Doha, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, for those of you who are interested, does one of the largest public opinion surveys in existence. It's called the Mu'ashir al-Arabi, the Arab Index, and it's an annual thing. They just produced the 5th year of that, and it cuts across the board. All topics, political, social, religious, what have you. So if you're interested, you can look at their website, ACRPS, Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and it's done annually. I think of course, all these questions, even though that was not necessarily reflected clearly in the colors, the charts particularly, but all these questions had, I don't know, or I do not care to comment. So that is basically one way to reflect the lack of knowledge on this issue, or I don't know anything about it. So that's available. Palestinians, as a person of Palestinian origin, I can tell you most of my crowd tend to know it all. So we always have answers to anything that you ask us. No, it's the nature of the beast. It's the nature of their experience. The fact that you're talking about a society that is heavily politicized by virtue of its own ordeal. So you grab a 10-year-old kid down the street and, he might answer questions that are at the college level in the US, not because he's or she is smarter, but because their ordeal dictates that they get to know the details of what's affecting their lives. Now, with that in mind, I accept your point that yes, some citizens in some countries are more, let's say, open and more educated in some of these issues that impact their daily lives. And that goes, and it's related, of course, to their education, it's related to their form of government, it's related to the freedom of the press in their country or the lack thereof. And so we take these factors in mind, at least in terms of, I mean, some things we can help when you conduct surveys. For example, let's say the level of education, okay, which with a certain level of education, you'd assume that the person reads or watches and goes on the internet and looks for certain topics and so on. So that's why that is a major factor in selecting the sample, level of education. So we try to make sure that not only just gender and geography, and age group, also level of education is also included in the factors. Yes, ma'am. Did you want to add? Go ahead.
I wanted to answer his question.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry about that.
Sorry about that, yeah.
It's okay.
Well, thanks for pretending that I could be president. But anyway, what can a president not do to change American foreign policy in the Middle East? I mean, anything. If it were up to me, I think just flip the page and start afresh, and whatever you did on the first page, do the opposite on the second. There is the United States is the leading country in the world. The United States leads by experience, leads by example, leads by abilities, capabilities. The very first thing, however, in foreign policy is a new president should put in people who deal with the Middle East or any part of the world, not as political appointees. You put in people who have been in the field. You put in people who know what needs to be done. You don't want to appoint people in foreign policy who are just absolutely trying to continue the old policies, because the old policies have proven to have been wrong. You try your best to try to assist democratic development. I noticed from the survey that one of the answers to the question, to the survey's question about what is most really significant that you want somebody to talk about, or something about, an important issue in the Middle East or something like that. And democratic development, unfortunately, received about 3 or 4% of people who said that they would want to work. You need to improve people's lives. I mean, what can the United States do to improve people's lives? Everything. And the United States is called upon to do all this. Yes, it is. It could be very costly. Yes, it could be very time-consuming. But if you want the United States to have a good footing in the Middle East, you got to do what the Middle East needs. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, this is. We're not saying that you want to re-pivot back to the Arab world and not go to East Asia and challenge China there, because China is challenging you. But don't abandon. Don't leave the Middle East to its own fortunes. I think the United States can play a very, very leading role in trying to change things there: economic, political, social, anything.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Mystery Advisors. I have a question for your post-election survey, please. Will you be including a section on their expectations of the people back in the region on how many people who are of Arab descent that would be relocating outside of America after this election?
I don't think so. That is, I doubt that will be a significant factor, frankly, and it's something that pertains to the community here rather than to the Arab world in general. Thank you anyway for asking the question. Last question, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Helena Bogusławska from the delegation of the European Union. Thank you very much for the very interesting survey. I think it confirms many of the intuitive analysis, but it's very interesting to see it done in a scientific way. I have a short question about the last slide that you showed, the priorities for the U.S. engagement. One of the priorities was also the more U.S. involvement in the Syrian crisis, not only fighting ISIL, which is current U.S. government priority, but also in the Syrian crisis as well. Given the sample of the countries where you have conducted the survey, was it mainly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, or was it across the board that the expectation was that the U.S. should be more involved in the crisis?
I think in his remarks, Ahmad referred to that. I think it does cut across the Arab world. The situation in Syria right now, there is almost a consensus throughout the Arab world that there needs to be first to stop the bloodshed in Syria, and there needs to be some kind of intervention for a peaceful solution that satisfies the wishes of the Syrian people themselves, which has been lacking in some previous attempts. There were attempts at diktat, there were attempts at shoving specific ideas down Syrians' throats and so on. But in terms of the concern, in general, we did not detect that, even though the numbers are different, but if we had a question that dealt with this issue alone, independent, I think you will see a much more consistency and probably much larger number. I would estimate over 70% would basically, similar to some of the other questions, that would endorse Syria taking a higher position on the list of priorities of the U.S. and the world community. That has been substantiated by many, many, many surveys over the years. And even though we did not ask that question, other than basically offering it as one alternative to recommend for the next U.S. president, I have a feeling that the support is uniform, cuts across countries, borders, regions in the Arab world, and all the other factors, including age and ethnicity and education and what have you. I think most Arabs are very upset with the way that situation in Syria has deteriorated and would like to see it stop and stop being used by outside powers for their own interests. Yes, Yusuf.
Just briefly on that last question of the top two issues. So the leading issue is stay out, right? People say we don't want the U.S. to get involved.
Leave us alone.
But all of the other issues involve the U.S. being more involved in these, different areas. So clearly, people who chose the first answer as one of their top priorities also chose another answer. How do you explain what seems to be this contradiction between, a suspicion of U.S. involvement in the region and also a desire to see some sort of resolutions to these issues?
Either one? Okay, I'll give it a try, and Ahmad, if you want to add, please. Again, I mean, the purpose of that question was to simply list some priorities for the respondents to pick from as to what they perceive should be the focus of the United States on these issues. That the discrepancy is anytime you have this type of question where you ask people, instead of rating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then give him priority, you want him to pick one. You get results that are not necessarily high in numbers, but they certainly express the sentiment of the respondents. So in that sense, definitely the Arab world is conflicted right now. There is a lot of talk about the need for the U.S. and the need for the international community to weigh in. As you well know, as an expert on the region yourself, there is a lot of history behind that, but there is also a lot of frustration in the Arab world for the either the lack of sincerity or the lack of quality in the attempts by countries like the United States in trying to mediate objectively and fairly and in a neutral, effective way some of these conflicts. And that's why some of these conflicts are older than most of us in this room. That I think reflects the serious weakness in these attempts in the past. So I do not blame, I'm not surprised by that sentiment. It is there, it's very strong. For those of us who interact with Arab public opinion, whether non-scientifically like you and I do, daily on Twitter and Facebook and what have you, that sentiment is very strong. You could see it all the time. You guys leave us alone. Do not advocate more U.S. intervention. It hasn't proved useful in the past, and we don't see that as changing. But at the same time, when you focus on the issue, you also see that desperation on the part of people, particularly vis-a-vis Syria, particularly vis-a-vis Palestine, those two issues in particular. You see that in the Gulf vis-a-vis Yemen. So all these live conflicts right now create that contradiction, that sentiment in a divided public opinion in the Arab world. On the one hand, they want help to stop the bloodshed and to end these conflicts. On the other hand, they're not very enthused and very pleased about the past experience with U.S. intervention in particular. Okay, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. And we'll be circulating, as I said, an updated version of the survey. Look at our website, arabcenterdc.org. We will add this afternoon the last results that arrived this morning with regards to Jordan.